This is a 1991 BMW M5, and it is an iconic sports sedan. The E34 was the second generation of the M5, and it was only sold in North America for 3 years, 91 to 93. It was also the last hand-built M car, and it helped set the tone for the BMW M models that followed. And today, I'm going to review it. Before I get started, I should say that this E34 M5 is currently live for sale right now on Cars and Bids, which is my new online car auction website for modern enthusiast cars. Yes, that's right, this exact E34 M5 is live right now being auctioned. The auction went up today and you can go check it out. This car perfectly fits what we're looking for at Cars and Bids, which is cool enthusiast cars from the modern era, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and up. So go check out the E34 M5 auction live right now. Go bid on it by clicking the link in the description below to go to carsandbids.com. So let's talk E34 M5. The original M5, the E28, came out here in North America for the 1988 model year, and it was sort of a test case to see if the North American market was really interested in a high-performance version of the BMW 5 Series. They were, so this came out as the second generation model in 1991, with BMW still cautiously proceeding in revealing its M performance cars to the North American market. I say that because BMW built the E34 M5 for 7 years, but it was only offered here in North America for 3, and only as a sedan, even though a wagon was offered in Europe. And it was never available here with the larger engine that was offered in some markets. This car was clearly still BMW testing the waters to see how well an M car would be received in North America. But it was still a pretty special vehicle, a hand-built car with a 315 horsepower 6-cylinder, a mandatory manual transmission, and a lot of other upgrades over the regular 5 Series that made it the ultimate performance sedan of the early 1990s. Of course, it also came with the ultimate price tag. Back when this car was new, it had a sticker price of around $61,000, which translates to about $110,000 in today's money. So today I'm going to review this E34 M5 and show you what you got when you spent 110 grand 30 years ago. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of this car and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the E34 M5 with getting in, and I want to talk about the key. Now, this car was before the era of keyless remote entry for BMW, but they did have one idea for how to make it easier to get in the car. You look at the key and you can see there's a BMW logo, which is actually a button, and there's also a little light near the top of the key. The way this was supposed to work was you would press the BMW logo and it would light up that light right next to your key. And that way, if you were approaching your car in a dark parking lot, you would press the button, the key would be illuminated so you could see exactly where you could stick it in, and that would make it easier for you to get in your car. Not quite keyless entry, but hey, it was something. And next up, the first thing you notice when you climb inside this car is the phone. This car has a car phone in between the front seats, a BMW branded corded phone, and I absolutely love it and I'm obsessed with it. Unfortunately, this phone does not work. No car phones from this era work anymore, but it is still a wonderful relic and a cool conversation piece and a factory option that was included in this car back when it was new 30 years ago. You must have felt pretty boss having a phone in your M5 back then. And next up, next to the phone in the center, you have the window switches. Not all that unusual, arranged pretty much how you would expect them. The cool thing thing here is the lockout switch, which is this subtle button placed between the two rear window switches. If you press that, it locks out the rear windows, so your rear passengers can't control them if your kids are being annoying with the windows back there. I just like this subtle little integration of this button. Doesn't need a label. And next up, further forward in the center console, you have the gear lever. Like I mentioned, this car has a manual transmission, and all E34 M5s had a manual. You couldn't get one of these with an automatic. They were for true driving enthusiasts only. The cool thing I like about this gear lever is the fact that it lights up at night. Let me cup my hands around it and turn the headlights on, and you can see the top part lights up so you can see the gear pattern even at night, which I always thought was amazing attention to detail and a good example of how BMW really wanted the cars to be driver focused. They thought that was important enough to show you even in the dark. And next up, moving further forward from the gear lever up to this panel on the center console, is that the cup holders? No. German cars from this era don't have cup holders, but they do have ashtrays and cigarette lighters, which is what that is. I always found it funny that Germans from this era constantly made fun of Americans for wanting cup holders in their cars. The thinking was, oh, those fat Americans always want access to a soft drink even while they're performing the sacred act of driving. And yet, German cars from this era always have a cigarette lighter and ashtray so that Germans can always have access to a cigarette, even when they're performing the sacred act of driving. Seems a little hypocritical. And speaking of the Germans, moving up in the center console, you have the climate controls. These are pretty straightforward, although I do like the fact that the controls for the airflow positioning are these dials that you can place precisely where you want. In most cars, it's just on or off, but in this you can exactly set the amount of upper air and lower air and middle air that you want for the perfect airflow experience, which I'm sure was appreciated by the precision-minded Germans who built this car. And next up, moving up from there, you have the stereo head unit. This car still has its original BMW factory head unit, which is really impressive. That's actually mated to a CD changer, which I'll show you in a minute. Obviously, the functionality of this is limited compared to modern stereos with Bluetooth and CarPlay, but you have a BMW logo on the cassette tape door. You won't get that if you put a modern CarPlay head unit in your E34 M5. This is the real deal. But to me, the coolest part of this entire center control stack is over on the right, where you have the beginnings of the BMW infotainment system. You see all these little buttons and this little screen? That's where it began. With modern BMW center control stacks, you can browse Twitter and buy movie tickets, and that all started right here. This is sort of an advanced trip computer. You can see your range, you can see your average speed, your average fuel economy, your temperature. It was the beginning of a configurable information display in the center, and you can see how the modern infotainment system evolved from that. This really is where it all started. It seems very pedestrian by modern standards, but this is the beginnings of infotainment in a car. And next up, moving above all of the center stack controls, you have the climate vents. Nothing unusual there. Two of them in the middle, pretty standard. But above those, you have another giant vent. So what is this thing? Well, it's another climate vent. This one for air that was designed to be blown straight up in the interior instead of right on you. It's an absolutely massive climate vent, but that's what it was there for. Increased airflow in the interior in a slightly different place than the rest of your climate control vents. And speaking of unusual climate vents in this car, another interesting quirk, the vents over on the sides of the dashboard for the driver and passenger aren't on the dashboard at all. You can see they're on the doors, actually, and when you open up the door, the vent opens with it, both on the driver's side and over on the passenger side. A few cars have used this over the years, but it's unusual to see. But the E34 M5 did it, probably for packaging reasons on the dashboard. They just didn't have enough room to stick the vents on there and make them look good. And next up, speaking of climate control, this car has heated seats, which are controlled by this little switch next to the seat itself. Two different stages of heated seat. That was a pretty advanced advanced feature for 1991, but you expected it in a luxury car of this ilk. In terms of seat controls, what you didn't expect was the thigh support. Check this out. This little switch extends out the thigh support in the front of the seat to give taller drivers more support on long drives. That is an impressive feature. Very few cars have that. A lot of BMWs do, but it's usually a manual lever that you pull. In this car, power-operated thigh support. Only the finest German luxury. And next up, another interesting control in this car is the headlight controls, which are quite strange. Over to the left of the gauge cluster, you can see there's a big switch, and then at the top of that, there's like a rectangular window. And whichever item the window has in its window is where your headlights are positioned. So you can see it's on 0, the headlights are off, but if you move it up, the window shows different headlight positions and then they're on. It's a very unusual way to do it, but that's what they did on the E34 5 Series. And next up, onto the gauge cluster itself, you can see this is a pretty straightforward BMW gauge cluster from this era. Nothing unusual or especially odd in here, although I will say at the bottom you do have this pixel display. This was one of the earliest BMW models to have this, and you could adjust what it showed you by pressing the end of the turn signal stalk. You push that and it would give you your range, the temperature, your average speed, all of that sort of thing. Now this is still true in BMW models today. You press the end of the signal stalk and the gauge cluster changes to show you different displays and information, and this is one of the cars where it started on. You can again see some of the origins of still existing BMW interior design. And speaking of BMW interior design, I want to talk about the general look of this car's interior, specifically this center control stack, which you can see is tilted a few degrees towards the driver. That was a huge deal at the time. Basically, every other car always had just a flat dashboard and everything was just as easily in reach of the passenger as the driver. But BMW started pitching its cars as the ultimate driving machine. And so they wanted to provide a more driver-focused interior like a cockpit. And that was the result. The center stack tilted a few degrees so it faced the driver instead of the general interior. Obviously now that's become a common feature in modern sports car and performance car interior design, these driver-focused cockpit cabins, but this was one of the very first cars that did it, and it created a huge splash when they did that passengers would be a little cut off from all of the switches and controls in the middle. Also worth mentioning in here is the interior quality is absolutely fantastic. Everything looks beautiful in here. The seats, the dashboard, no cracking plastics or leathers. Truly impressive for a 30-year-old car. This is how it would have looked if you had been a rich CEO with an eye on performance, picking one of these up new off the showroom floor back in '91, and that would have been cool. Although, in full disclosure, it is worth noting for the cars and bids crowd that the sun visor lights have burned out. So if you get this car, you will not be able to look at yourself as brightly as possible. And next up, moving on to the back seat of the E34 M5, where you can see that rear seat room is decent, but not exactly huge. It definitely doesn't have the interior room of a mid-size sedan like we would think about them today, but that makes sense because this car is the exact same length as a new 3 Series, down to the 1/10 of an inch. They are identical. So this formerly mid-size sedan is now considered a compact. Everything is growing, and that's why this car feels a little cramped for a 5 Series. Now, other interesting quirks back here. One is that once again, you have a cigarette lighter back here and individual ashtrays on the rear doors, one on the passenger side and one over on the driver's side so that your kids can smoke. Another classic example, cup holders was a ridiculous idea by the unhealthy, distracted driving Americans, but putting a cigarette lighter and ashtrays in the back seats with your kids, that was a reasonable thing to do in early 90s Germany. Other notable items back here, one is this giant center armrest. You put this thing down, it's like 4 inches high, and it gives you a nice little place to comfortably rest your arm. But by far the most interesting thing back here is the fact that the seat belts come out of the center, not the edges of the seat like you're used to. They come out of the middle, and you buckle them into this strange seatbelt buckle that's integrated into the seat and colored to match. It's an odd thing back here, reaching into the middle for the seatbelt and then putting it into that weird fixed buckle. Definitely different from what I'm used to. And next up, I want to talk styling, because I love how this car looks. Just the general design of the E34 5 Series I've always loved. I think it's clean and simple and elegant and not fussy or over the top at all. But I also love how subtle the M5 is over the regular 5 Series. You have an M5 badge up front, you have an M5 badge in back, and the rest are just a few little subtle details that basically nobody else would ever notice. It is such a departure from modern M and AMG cars that scream what they are. Back then, you had to look very closely to see what it was you were getting beaten by. And next up, we move on to the trunk in the E34 M5, which contains some hidden treasures. Open it up, and the first interesting thing you notice is on the inside of the trunk lid, where you have this plastic compartment. You unscrew the top part, pull it down, and there's a toolkit in here full of all the tools you could need to operate your M5 on the roadside. But that's not the most interesting thing in this toolkit. What I like best in here is this little diagram of a car, which is actually an E28 BMW 5 Series, and frankly, a pretty good diagram of one. Now, I've mentioned that diagram in other reviews I've done of BMWs from this era. What I haven't mentioned is over to the right, where you have a BMW cloth. Look at this, a BMW branded cloth. This is how you know a car has been beautifully preserved, because the manufacturer branded cloth has been saved for 3 decades in the toolkit. Pretty cool. And kind of gross. Anyway, other interesting stuff in this trunk. One is the 6-disc CD changer, which is mounted back here. You open up this little door, then press the eject button, and then the CD magazine ejects. You pull it out and put in your CDs one by one. This was actually pretty common for early CD changers. The crazy thing here is that this car has a CD changer at all. In '91, this must have been a huge deal, probably one of the earliest cars with this feature. And speaking of electronics, next to this CD changer, you can see there's a little label that says pre-wired for BMW cellular phone. This, of course, relates to the phone I showed you inside. This is probably where the wires go, but it's just interesting to see this label. This isn't one you see very often in any modern automobile. Ever. 2 other notable items in the trunk. One is over to the right, you have this little storage cubby, which I am sure is precisely sized to fit the bottle of motor oil that is recommended by BMW for this vehicle. Such a German thing, and I have no doubt they made it perfect. Another good example of German attention to detail is this little arrow you can see when you're standing behind the trunk. What exactly is that for? Well, behind that arrow, you have the trunk handle. You reach in, grab it, and you can close the trunk. So that arrow is letting you know how to close the trunk most effectively and efficiently. I would expect nothing less from a well-built German sedan. And next up, I want to talk wheels. This car has the throwing star wheels, as BMW enthusiasts call them. They are by far the most popular and the most attractive wheel that was offered on this car, but they were not the most interesting. That honor goes to the turbine wheels, which look like this. You can see they're a little odd. They were 3-piece wheels with kind of a turbine design on the inside that were intending to send air towards the brakes while the car drove along in order to cool the brakes. It was a neat idea, but the problem is they just look terrible, like small wheels with white wall tires. Not a very attractive look for an aggressive German performance sedan, but it was an innovative idea to help cool the brakes in the days before modern technology gave us more options there. Nonetheless, I've always preferred the look of the throwing stars. And finally, we move under the hood. which is interesting in itself because it's front hinged. You can see when it's open, it kind of gives the car a more special look. But anyway, let's talk engine. 3.6 liters straight six, 315 horsepower. The result was 0 to 60 in about 6.3 seconds. Now, those numbers aren't particularly impressive by modern standards, and in fact, later in this car's production run, BMW bumped this up to a 3.8 liter engine with 335 horsepower, but that was never offered in North America. Still, by the standards of its time, this was pretty good. This was an era before everybody had a performance sedan. There was no CTS-V, there was no E34 AMG. This was one of the only games in town, and it was pretty impressive back then. Just the fact that BMW did it at all, and you had this manual transmission M car in North America, was pretty cool. Now, as for the engine itself, I love how this looks. You have BMW M Power prominently written to make sure everyone knew it wasn't a regular BMW. You also have the M logo over on the other side. That's just cool, and it still looks cool 30 years later. As for the car, well, this is a rare one. Like I mentioned, this was the last hand-built BMW M car, and they didn't hand-build too many, only 12,200 for the entire world over the 7-year production run, and less than 1,700 of those came to North America. This is one of those 1,700, so you go drive in an E34 M5, you're not likely to encounter another one anytime soon, or ever. And so those are the quirks and features of the E34 BMW M5. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the E34 M5. Now, before I get into the drive, a little more background on this car. The E34 M5 has kind of found itself for many years in sort of the not as appreciated era of the M5. The E28s are always well known. They're the first ones. They were all black here in North America. One model year, pretty rare. They're very special. The E39 M5 has had this legend grow around it as sort of the last manual V8 analog, blah, blah, blah. And it was so good looking and simple. The E34s with their 6-cylinder, they just didn't quite have the same clout until about the last 2 or 3 years. And now this car is starting to develop sort of some recognition and an audience for the same reason that a lot of collectible cars like this do, which is not because it's fast, not because it handles better than a modern car, but because it's rare and it's special. And when I think E34 M5, that's what I think. Obviously, a new one is way faster, way better in every way, but when I see an E34 M5 on the street, that's a head turn, point at it, take a picture, send it to your friends kind of car. And the new one is miles away from being that. And at some point, when you get into a world where even a Camry is doing 0 to 60 in 5 point something, being the fastest starts to matter less, and having something special matters more, and I think that's why these cars stars on the rise. Of course, there's more to it than just that. This is also an analog car, absolutely a beautiful car. I've always felt the E34 probably the best looking 5 Series, even though most people think it's the E39. It's close, but I like the boxier look of the E34. You also have manual transmission, no screens, none of that stuff, and it's reasonably fun to drive. Now, 0 to 60 in 6.3 and a 315 horsepower engine, not huge numbers, but it's a fun, usable car, and it feels pretty tossable. I enjoyed the new M340i, and I talked about how I liked its size. Well, this is the exact same size, except you have a naturally aspirated engine with decent power up front, you got a manual transmission, and you just have a more enjoyable car, less regulations, less stuff to separate you from the road. It definitely doesn't feel slow, but I wouldn't say that it feels especially fast. The owner described it as period correct speed, and I think that's such a great way to put it. It was fast at the time. No, you won't have your socks knocked off if you get in this by modern standards, but you know, there's also something to be said for you get a 90s car, you go 90s car speed, and for people who are into this kind of stuff, 60s cars, 70s cars, they're used to making that trade-off. I really do love the interior in this car, and this one is especially nicely kept. It's interesting, I've been looking for an E34 M5 to review for quite some time. It's very difficult to find one in nice shape. I think that's also contributing to the values rising on these cars. People bought them to drive, they drove them, then they moved them on to the next owner. So many of these have 6 owners and 200,000 miles. Now this one has 172,000 miles, but it's clearly been maintained tremendously well, and the current owner is a BMW
BMW enthusiast who's kept up and kind of put it back into a nicer shape than when he found it.
And so that's the 1991 E34 BMW M5. I've always loved this car, and I've especially loved how it looks. I think this is probably the best looking 5 Series, yes, even better than the iconic E39. Now granted, this car doesn't have the E39 M5's V8 up front, but it's still a special car, looks great, drives well, and it's a good example of some of the beginnings of BMW M. And now it's time to give the E34 M5 a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I love how this looks. I think the E34 is absolutely beautiful for a sedan, for a 90s car, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 6.3 seconds, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Handling is fine, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is okay. It's fun, and then it's an M car with reasonably sharp handling and sort of good acceleration, but it's not wildly thrilling, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and these are pretty cool, especially for an M car, which has become commonplace in the car enthusiast world. Not this M car, though. You never see these, and it's exciting. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 26 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. This car is well equipped for the time period, but pretty mediocre by modern standards, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is average, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is okay. These are reasonably reliable and reasonably nice inside, but not ultra amazing quality, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and this car does well. I think these are still undervalued given the rarity and the special status as an early M car, but they are starting to gain recognition and come up in value, so it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 26 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 52 out of 100, which places it here against some other 90s performance cars and BMW M cars. The E34 M5 ties the Mercedes 500e, which is probably its closest competitor, but they come to the score in different ways. The M5 has a higher weekend score, the 500e has a higher daily score, no surprise. Overall, the E34 M5 is a fun car, but mostly it's a special car, which is why it's been attracting more interest in recent years.